Good evening, everyone, and welcome. There's an on-off button on the bottom. Okay, there we go. We're getting control of the technology. Thank you all for coming this evening. We think you'll really enjoy this program. We think it's a very dynamic program. If you've never seen the Rutgers Debate Team in action, you really are about to have a treat. This event this evening is in acknowledgement of the anniversary of the ratification of our U.S. Constitution. Universities all over the country have events wherein we talk about what our Constitution is, what it means. But here at Rutgers, we decided to do something a little bit different. The Rutgers University Debate Team agreed to debate a topic that has come up in our student activist circles over and over again as we increasingly are concerned about the cost of college education. So I couldn't be happier that Story Clayton, the coach of the Rutgers Debate Team, and many members of the Rutgers Debate Team, some in the audience as well as up here tonight, have agreed to come out tonight and engage in this discussion. I'd also like to thank the faculty members who have come out tonight. We have 3 faculty members who will be part of just a general response to help us engage in conversation about the issues raised in the competitive debate between these 2 teams up here. We have here tonight Professor Rudy Bell, who is former chair of the history department and an expert on Italian history. We have Professor Andrew Murphy, who is professor of political science, and he is also the director of the Walt Whitman Center for the Culture and Politics of Democracy at Rutgers, and he's agreed to be the faculty director of the new Darien Learning Community in the Theory and Practice of American Constitutional Democracy, which I think has the record of being the longest title of any learning community at Rutgers. And also with us tonight is Susan Lawrence, the SAS Dean for Educational Initiatives and the Core Curriculum. So this is what's going to happen tonight. We are going to introduce Story Clayton and turn this microphone over to him in just a moment. We're going to have the debate, and this is all timed. There is a very serious rubric to be followed for this. We're then going to invite our faculty members up to the stage, and they're going to reflect on what they've heard and help us to focus maybe on some interesting topics. Then we're going to ask you, the audience, to vote for which team made the most compelling argument. Yes, we have ballots. We're going to hand them out. And you know this gentleman here, gray sweatshirt, he's got the ballots. Yes or no? I mean, or it's the yes team, the no team. Okay, it'll be clear to you. You're all in college. You can figure this out, you know. But while they are tabulating the results, we're going to engage in a Q&A just here, have a discussion. We're not a big crowd. We think we could just have a conversation while the students are counting the votes. The microphone's in the center aisle. You could just stand up and ask your question or share with us your comment. Afterwards, we have some student groups tabling in the other room. There's some refreshments out there, and we have the number of people from the libraries, from the Graduate School of Education. Are You Voting is here. The 4-H group here at Rutgers is here to engage you in signing up for their volunteer activities. So please do give them a look as you're taking a look at the refreshment table, because they do a lot of good work, a lot of good civic engagement work here at Rutgers and the surrounding communities, and you might just like what you see. So without further ado, let me turn this microphone over to Story Clayton, the coach of the Rutgers University Debate Team. Story.
Good evening, everyone. As advertised, I'm Story Clayton, and this is my 3rd year coaching the Rutgers University Debate Union. We serve the role as the debate team, but our official name is the Debate Union. We've been on campus for about 10 years. And last year, we were ranked 5th in the country. Princeton was ranked 18th. So, and this year, we're only a couple weeks into the season, but so far we're ranked 7th in the country, and Princeton has not made the rankings as yet. So, we always like to advertise our relative strength as the best debate team in New Jersey. So, what you're going to see tonight is going to be a shortened version of what we call parliamentary debate. This is the format of debate that we compete in every weekend, and if you like what you see here, we're going to have a table and some brochures and some information about how you can join. What we have, instead of an affirmative and a negative team, we call it a government and an opposition team because it's modeled on the British Parliament. And you'll also see some weird questions on the fly and some of the early speeches that are also modeled on parliamentary procedure. So that's one of the more entertaining parts of our debate format. Let me introduce the 4 debaters who will be speaking to you. The first, our Prime Minister for this evening, is David Rees. David Rees is a 5th-year senior, finishing up some requirements at Rutgers. He is a former president of the Debate Union, and last year he was part of the 7th-ranked individual partnership in the country, and was the 14th-ranked speaker in the country as an individual. He will be joined by the Member of Government, Bhargavi Sriram, who is a junior and will be directing our tournament this year. And she was one of 4 teams that we sent to nationals last year. On the opposition side, we have Ashley Novak. She's a sophomore and the treasurer of the Debate Union. Last year, she was the 2nd-ranked first-year debater in the entire country and was in one of the top 20 teams as a first year. And she will be joined by the member of opposition, Stephen Yellen, who is a 2nd-year graduate student here. He is our public relations chair, and he won 2 novice division titles last year in individual tournaments. So without further ado, we will begin the debate. I will be moderating and timing the debate. And just as a reminder, the resolution before the House is resolved: the Constitution ought be amended to include a right to a free college education. Are both sides ready?
We are.
Then I call this House to order and call on the Right Honorable Prime Minister David Rees to open the round on the resolution this year. Here, 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 here.
Is it working?
Thank you, everybody. It's great to see people out here honoring our Constitution on its long, long anniversary. And specifically, we want to go back and change it. So here's how we're going to do that. We think that there should be a right to a free education in the Constitution. And we think that there should be a right, obviously, for anyone who actually gets into college. We're not going to defend a right to a free education for anyone, because that seems a little overly broad. We are going to say that if you get into college and you have any financial pressure on you at all, the government should immediately step in and pay all your expenses. And if they don't, you should be able to sue them the way you would if they violate any of your other constitutional rights. So to that end, we have 4 major arguments we're going to advance. The first is simply about the role of government. What we're going to say here is essentially that the role of government is to create a better society for all of us. Now, many people think of rights in a different way from this, but we're actually going to say that rights exist in cases where there would otherwise be a problem. So college education is something that most of us would probably want. And any given individual, if they got into college, would want to be able to go that and not be constrained by the financial costs of a college education. But recognize that any other individual in society has a reason to not want to pay higher taxes to subsidize them. So what we do in these situations is we try and look at society not for who we actually are, but what kind of rules we would want in society. And I think it's actually pretty obvious that we want a society where anyone who is deserving can actually go to college, where you are not simply consigned by a lottery of birth to be in a position where because your parents made decisions that meant that they don't have a lot of money, you don't have the option of bettering yourself. I think that's something we would want to exist in our society. Secondly, under this though, we're going to tell you that it's also just a facilitated right. It's a right that lets people gain other rights. So if you look at education, for example, and we'd say there should probably be a right to some other forms of education as well, right? We tell you that you have to get an education up till you're 16 in high school. We can't just say, you have that right, but we're not gonna pay for it, right? You have to go to private schools or your parents can teach you. The government's not going to provide anything. That would be absurd. And the reason that's absurd is because we recognize that you need basic skills to advance yourself, right? We need to teach you to read and write and have some basic concept of math and things like that in order to advance in society. But at the point where you don't have those things, you're not reaching your potential. But if you reach even more potential, if you're a person who's moved past that and actually has the ability to continue to grow intellectually, We think it's the government's obligation. The same way, we would think it would be absurd to ask you to get a high school education and then not actually provide it for you, for the government not to pay in this case.
Speaking on the concept of absurdity, sir, you mentioned that in the current society that we have, that basically we want people to pay less taxes in order to be able to go to college. So let me understand this. Under your platform, you're going to have people pay more taxes in the form of making up for the educational costs in order to provide people with a free education. How is that not absurd?
I have no idea what you just said. No idea. Okay, second point. Our second point is about minority rights. Specifically, that we believe minorities' rights are violated in a couple of ways. First of all, we think the young are a minority. Now, this may seem unintuitive, but we think that the reason we have protections in our Constitution is for a few reasons. But one of the big ones is to protect rights of people who otherwise would be outvoted, right? So for example, if you have an unpopular political opinion, we make sure you have an enumerated right to free speech so the rest of us can't all vote and say, sorry, but neo-Nazis don't get to talk anymore, right? We think similarly, the young are a minority in society insofar as they will always be outvoted by older groups with less interest in society and in college. If you look at the most influential group in society, it's the elderly, who will cling to their Medicare and Social Security with the icy grip of death. Like, the fact is, we have no way of actually getting past those groups, so we think the young deserve some protection. Additionally, though, actual minorities, right? Recognize that, like it or not, if you live in America, there's a pretty good chance that if you're black, you're also poor, and that means we're actually, whether deliberately or not, discriminating against minority groups by effectively denying them a college education. Thirdly, we're going to talk about loans. We think that loans are bad. We think they're predatory. We think they destroy people's lives. We think no one should have to deal with that. Additionally, though, we think they force people into certain careers. I don't know about you, but I'm sick of all the business majors who exist out there and all the engineers. I want more people to go into unviable careers because they don't actually need the money. I have 30 seconds. Final argument, very quickly. Helping the poor. We think that when poor people know that if they actually get into college, they'll actually be able to afford to go, they will go. If you look at schools where entrepreneurs come in and offer to pay for everyone's high school education, they have incredibly high rates of people not dropping out and actually going to college. That's important because it sends a message in society. And when that first generation comes back, more people go to college. That's incredibly important. For all those reasons, we're proud to propose.
Remarks, and now call the Honorable Leader of the Opposition, Ashley Novak, to deliver the next constructive speech of the round, presenting the case for silence.
Hear, hear.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dave, for a really interesting case, and thanks, Story, for being here, and thanks, everyone, for coming. So we think that you absolutely should not have a right to a college education to be paid for in full for a few reasons. The first that we want to address is that basically having a college education is not the only thing that can bring good. That it's something that maybe if an individual wants, they ought to be able to pursue that, but it's not something that you need in order to have. That you can actually have a good job without having a degree. And in fact, when we provide this free right to education, what this does is it causes a lot of individuals who before wouldn't have had a degree to go and get a college degree. And as more individuals have college degrees, the less value that degree has. Because the importance of that degree is that it sets you apart, that it shows that you've put an additional effort that others haven't put in, that you've learned more than others, that you've taken steps to improve yourself. And when that becomes something extraordinarily common, that degree is no longer valuable. What this means is that in order to have job progression, you don't just need a college degree, but you also need a grad school degree. So it just defers the cost to a later education instead of allowing individuals to go to college and then graduate and then get a job. So now individuals not only have to go through college, but also have to go to grad school because college becomes the new high school. But we also think that this is problematic for another reason, that when you try to provide free college funding, imagine the cost that that has. We can't in the status quo pay for the high school systems. There are individual high schools that are using history textbooks from 10 years ago that don't include important conflicts, and now they're trying to pay for college as well. What this means is two things. The first is that the education system, which is already really bad, is going to get worse because we're going to try to stretch already thin money thinner, or we're going to have to raise taxes substantially, which means that you're essentially paying college loans just in another form. Yes.
So the problem now is the rich control the political system and don't want higher taxes. If there's an enumerated right, you can sue the government and actually force them to raise taxes to pay for a decent education system.
That doesn't just raise taxes on the rich, though. That raises taxes on everyone.
Here,
This
here.
still affects the poor when you raise taxes in those situations. And even if you're going to only raise taxes on the rich, that still affects the poor by default because those prices get put onto consumers. So we think that ultimately, when you raise the taxes either on the rich or the poor, you end up hurting the poor more. So I think that what you ought to do is try to fix the high school programs, and then individuals will have better access to college and not be forced into going into grad school. But the second thing we think is that when you have the federal government paying for college, what you actually do is create a federally regulated college system. We think this is really bad for a few reasons. We think that what this means is that the government decides what it wants to pay for and what it doesn't. So a lot of the extracurriculars and activities that we have now, if the government deems that they're not necessary, they'll cut them in order to save money. So maybe your rugby team isn't worth the government's funding, and they'll cut funding from that because it has the ability to do that. When universities are privately funded by students, they have the ability to have these programs because it's their money and they can put it where they want to, which is one of the reasons why Rutgers has many of the programs that we do have. So I think that in order to maintain diversity of extracurricular and curricular activities, that we should allow students to continue paying for these things. So Dave gives us a few arguments. The first that he gives us is that the role of the government is to create a better society, and that we don't want to be constrained as a society and we want to allow anyone to go to college. We think that for a few reasons this doesn't create a better society. It just changes the default from going to college to going to grad school in order to have more career progression. But it also undermines diversity in education when the government has to cut certain programs that it doesn't deem as utile. If Dave is really worried about seeing individuals going to school as being engineers and businessmen and wants people to take not productive careers, the worst thing that he can do is give the government the funding for this, because the government has no purpose in funding art. The government has no purpose in funding music because it's not bringing it profit, it's not bringing it utility. So we think that ultimately, if you want to allow there to be a better society, you should keep the funding of this in the hands of the citizens when they go to college, because that helps maintain that diversity and allows individuals to pursue the careers that they want to pursue. He says that education ought to be facilitated right, that you should be paid for it in order to get educated. We give you a response to this off case, which I think is quite true, that if you try to pay for all of this education, you end up just making everyone pay for it by default through taxation, so you're paying for it either way. And in fact, you make it worse and make it harder for individuals to get access to a good education when the funding is stretched even more thin than it currently is and education is not diversified. Then he talked about minority rights, how the young are a minority and have a very suppressed voice. So there are ways to get around this other than trying to pay for college education. We can do more education towards voting and have more voting initiatives like we're having outside right now. So we think that there are other ways to get around the young not having a voice. And then he talks about race as being another problem, that individuals that are of certain ethnicities tend to be impoverished and don't have access to education as much. I think that we do solve for this in the status quo a lot. We do have programs like affirmative action to provide ways for these individuals to get into education, as well as the fact that if they work hard and put effort in, there are merit-based scholarships available. So we think that ultimately, if an individual wants to go to school, they actually have the option to do that in the status quo. He says loans are bad and they force people into careers that they don't want. So we think first, on his side of the house, you're more likely to be forced into careers that you don't want for a few reasons. The first is the government eliminating other options, and the second is that the taxes that you're paying are going to be substantially raised. And we think that the reason that individuals choose careers that they don't want isn't just because of loans. For example, good friends of mine who are here on full rides are taking engineering careers because they want to make more money. I'm here on loans, and I'm choosing to go into taking foreign languages and literatures because that's something that I want to do. So we think that the reason that we're seeing individuals taking these careers is because they want more money after school, and not necessarily because of loans. And recognize that there are other aids happening that help minimize the impact of loans on students. The final thing that he says is the poor, that the poor don't have access to education as much as they want. We think that we have a lot of programs in the status quo to help them out, but what ultimately makes it worse is when you force the burden of paying for everyone's education on the poor through raising taxes.
Thank you for further remarks, and now call the Honourable Member of the Government, Rutger University Debate Union, to continue the case for side government.
Okay, so what Ashley basically started off her LOC was by saying that if people have more college degrees, it undervalues the value of college degree, and somehow that's bad for society. How is it bad for society if more people are educated and more people can actually pursue careers which will be helpful for society in the long run, right? Where people can actually self-actualize, and they can reach their potential. We don't think this is a bad choice for society, and we think on our side of the house, we'll facilitate options like that where people can go ahead, get educated, and reach their potential, right? So the first point that Ashley brought up was basically that having a college education, like it kind of, if getting one, then it's going to be a bad thing. Firstly, no, it won't be a bad thing. But secondly, we think other than having a college degree, there are many other ways in which you can differentiate yourself by showing what kind of initiatives you've taken, extracurriculars that you've taken. And it's not the case that if you have a college degree and somebody else has a college degree, you guys have equal value, right? But on the other hand, if you don't have a college degree, you face significant disadvantage. Not only personally, but society as a whole does too. Secondly, she tells you that having a college degree shows that you put in work and that shows that you've taken initiative to reach that point. But the reality of the situation is that many people don't get that opportunity, right? And many people who do work really hard, juggle jobs even in high school, cannot get to go to college because they just can't afford it. And on our side of the house, we think it should be an obligation of the government. When it's like you don't really choose to be poor when you're like 17 or 18. It's just a lottery that you hit. It's unfortunate. And we think that the government has an obligation in that case. Pay for your college so they facilitate so that you can avail of the other rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. Then they also talk about how high school is not funded well enough. About how high school is not funded well enough and that we should concentrate on funding high schools first. We think that's okay too, but that depends more on community taxes, right? And we think at the point where we guarantee an education, if you can't afford it, it's reasonable for you to raise taxes. People are not going to get angry, right? When do people get angry when they have to pay taxes? When they think they don't get any benefits in return. At the point where they do get benefits, we don't think it will be so big a deal. Then they lastly talk about how this creates a federally regulated college, right? Where the government gets to decide what programs stay and what programs go away. I mean, status quo, Rutgers got its fencing team last year. That happens in status quo too. But what we say is when more people don't have to face the burden of loans on them, they'll probably want to give back to their college. Like many graduates from Rutgers, when they go out, they can't afford to give, they afford to donate to Rutgers, right? Because they're burdened by student loans. And that's the case with many other colleges. At the point where they don't have to face this burden, they can probably be better at their jobs because they don't have that stress, and they actually want to give back to college because they realize that their college probably needs it, right? And we think that fixes for it. Going on, case. The first point that Dave brought up was about the role of government, right? And how we have rights in cases where we don't have a right is kind of a problem. And what does she tell you? She gives you this really weird point about how this undermines the diversity of careers that people would take. We don't think so. We think at the point where more people are educated, you have a wider option of, you have a wider variety of careers to choose from. When I started out, I wanted to be a psychology major, right? But I saw that there are other stuff that college offers too. And we think that when people go into college, you have a wider variety of careers, and it's not that you're forced into one or the other. And we also talk about the veil of ignorance, right? Which is basically saying that you don't know where you'll be born in society. You'd want to go to a society which will give you a pre-college education if you can't afford it. And we tell you that that's how rights are decided. You choose to have some rights in society, which you will need to make it like smoother operating society, right? Which gives you some sort of assurance, some sort of guarantee. And we think that knowing that if you are able to put in the work, that the government will provide for your future opportunities, is a very assuring kind of right to have. Then we also talk about facilitated rights, about how facilitated rights are basically rights to let you make use of the other rights that you have. Like if you don't really get a good education, having like free speech rights, not really helpful, right? Because we don't think you'd be able to exercise them meaningfully. Or having a right to property is not really, because you might not even have the ability to afford property. So we think that this is a fundamental facilitated right, and it's very, very important to have in society. She again gives you the same example about how it's not really going to help with how you can get a good job even without having a college degree. But the fact of the matter is, we don't think you would be getting the best job. Let's say two very equally intelligent people go and apply to a job. They may be equally able, but the one with the college degree will get the job every single time, right? So we don't think that people actually there's actually any sort of meaningful, like fair system to make sure that able people get jobs that they deserve. Yes.
Under your system, how is the person that gets the job now just the person with the grad school degree instead of the college degree?
That's fine. I think others can get the grad school degree too. It's not like you're restricting them from getting grad school degrees. The more educated people are, the more educated our workforce is. It's better for America because there are other countries which are gaining an edge on us by the sheer force of education, right? We don't think it's a bad thing if more people opt to go to grad school or try to differentiate themselves in meaningful ways. Okay. Then lastly, we talk about minority rights, right? About how, this is very underhanded actually, about how the young are minority in the voting system right now. And what we tell you is like they really don't get to vote on their futures until they're 18 and already in college, where they can't actually affect the policies there, right? So we think that at the point where they are an exploited class, where older people would not really care about whether the young get to pay for college or anything, we ought to make sure that they are not exploited, which is the full purpose of democracy, right? And all she tells you is that, you know, we can have voting initiatives. Like I said, they can't really vote at that point. And she also talks about how we have affirmative action, things like that, for members of the community. Not all of them get to benefit by this, right? If you're not super intelligent, you may not even get to go to college because you're poor. And we think that this is disadvantageous to those members of the population. And lastly, we talk about loans. We think loans are like sharks, like banks are like sharks with the students, right? And we think it's highly exploitative. This is something that should be controlled for, especially when many people who sign this are not really mature enough to decide these things that impact their futures for a great plan. For all these reasons, we're very, very proud of this.
Thank the Speaker for his remarks, and finally call the Honourable Member of the Opposition, Stephen Yellen, to close the constructive phase of the round, reaffirming opposition's position.
For the record, I hope this debate is off the record, because as a candidate for office, the last thing I need to be known for is someone who gets humiliated by a college student on public record. With that in mind, it is a pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you, Ashley, for a great speech, and thank you to the government for introducing this interesting, I think ultimately futile case for a number of reasons. So the first thing I'd like to do is start with the off-case philosophy that we have presented in the round. But first, as I go back to achieve that, let me start with a quick overview. So basically what we have on the government side of the house is the assumption that we have to provide certain rights as enumerated by government for everyone. But what they fail to tell you on their side of the house is that with rights come responsibilities. With rights come obligations. And in this case, the obligations that the government is placing on us in society are on each and every one of you in this room and your parents and grandparents around this country. Consider that they would have the price of education be free as a major cost upon all of us in this country, whether or not we approve of that education or no. That is the burden that they are placing on each and every one of us in this room, and it is something they cannot justify in this round. So with that in mind, let's move to the off case. So the first thing that Bhargavi tells us, and that following up on Dave, in response to Ashley rather, is that this is bad for society if everyone's degree of education goes up. It's a wonderful thing for society if everyone's quality of education goes up. Here's the problem. On their side of the house, they don't get a better quality. They get a better quantity of education. There is a difference. In America, we've always prided ourselves on the ability to have the top quality of scientists, the top quality of teachers, of businessmen, of entrepreneurs, of people who work in factories and in the street factories and in farms. But on their side of the house, they don't improve the quality of America. They simply improve the mass quantity of a degree. Now, what is that degree really worth? We postulate on our side of the house that it's a matter of hard work, a matter of dedication, a matter of being willing to put the amount of effort you can that makes the difference between a successful American and someone who, under their side of the house, can only get a college degree by being helped out by Uncle Sam. No, thank you. So we think on our side of the house that we actually provide a better society for the ability to have more professional workers, more educated workers, and also a system in which, well, people can get ahead better. So the second thing Ashley tells us is that this is going to raise the amount of taxes on everybody in the system. And basically what David and Bhargavi try to tell us is, look, it's the obligation of society to pay for college. So I want to make sure that everyone here understands exactly the standard by which they're proposing here. Because if their standard were true, then each and every one of us has an obligation whenever someone else in this country has a certain need or requirement, regardless if it's in a different state, that on their side of the house, they say we ought to pay for it. In other words, the people of New Jersey have a responsibility to pay for the Tennessee Valley Authority under their standard. Or under their standard, the people of Maine have a requirement to pay for water irrigation treatment in California. So we think on our side of the house that's an unfair standard, and not something we want to place on any citizen in any part of the country. So we think on our side of the house, in addition to Bhargavi's analysis about, well, if it's okay if taxes go up because it's part of the community responsibility. Let me give you an example. There are school board elections every year in the state of New Jersey, and citizens go out to vote on the school budgets. Well, who do you think are the people who vote against school budgets most of the time? It's our senior citizens. Not because they're bad people,
but because they don't have any reason to vote for these school budgets most of the time. They no longer have children or grandchildren in the system. They no longer see it as part of their contribution to society. All they see is more taxes being placed on them and driving them out of their homes. And on their side of the house, you will have more examples of families being driven out of their homes, people unable to afford living in New Jersey or elsewhere because we have to now pay for everybody attending college when there isn't even a total benefit to it. So we think on their side of the house, they're contributing to economic problems that we have in this country rather than benefiting our ability to compete. So with that in mind, let's go on to the on case. So the first thing that Dave tells us on their side of the house is that, look, we want to have more education because that provides more options for people in society. But we argued on our side of the house that careers are more determined today in a better way than they would be on their side of the house. On our side of the house, careers are determined more by passion and what you're interested in than, for example, how much money you can make off of it. If I were more determined by money, I probably wouldn't have gone to grad school to get a communications degree. I'd be trying to make more money as a political consultant. But instead, I went to grad school because I wanted the university and I wanted the diverse community. On their side of the house, it'd be far more likely I wouldn't be here today debating, and I'd be trying to make a quicker buck. So the second thing they tell us is that we want to be born into a more educated society. They talk about the veil of ignorance. The problem is they actually create more ignorant people in society on their side of the house. And the reason for that is very simple. We already reward hard work in the status quo. We already tell people if you're smart enough and hardworking enough, we can help you get through college. They provide a system in which you can just get into college by the sheer nature of being 18 and graduating with a high school diploma, which a lot of us would admit isn't very hard to get in most places. So we think on our side of the house, we actually provide a system by which more people can actually do better in society rather than creating a blanket quantity that doesn't solve for quality. So the next thing they bring up, or rather Bargeby brings up, is the concept of how free speech, physical violence is not provable in Apple. Bargeby tells us that free speech and other rights ought to be available through education. But we already get those rights in the status quo. What we need is a better citizen education, not a college education. We need to have civics classes in high school that get people to care enough to get involved. Oh, thank you. In addition, they basically get the argument from Bargeby that, look, legacy matters when it comes to getting a job out of college. So their solution is to create an area where you have to go to grad school to get that leg up. And guess what? On their side of the house, the government's not paying for grad school. So tough. You're on your own. We still get the same basic inequality we have in the status quo. Then Bargeby says people under 18 have no voting rights, and we want to make sure they have more support. I've been involved in politics since I was 13. I've been a Democratic activist since then. I've actually covered a Democratic convention. You don't have to be 18 and a voter to be involved in politics. Finally, they want to say that, people ought to have voting rights if they're under 18 or legal rights. I say amend the Constitution. After all, isn't that what they're proposing? So with that in mind, we are very proud to oppose.
Recall the leader of the opposition to open the rebuttal phase of the round, summing up the case for the opposition without new arguments.
Hear, hear.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to you for being an excellent partner, and thanks to true friends on SideGov. So we have three main questions to close the round on. The first is a degree valuable? Because we tell you that you don't need a degree to get a good job, that you don't need a degree to pursue your best dreams, that if you put effort in status quo, even if you can't afford to go to college, you can still have a career that you've chosen to have. And Bargeby paints us a picture that tries to negate this point by saying, picture a world where two students that are equally motivated and equally skilled compete for a job. One has a college degree and one does not. The one with the college degree would most certainly get the job. In the world that they're designing, it's the same exact situation, except for the individual with the graduate degree gets the job, and the individual with the college degree does not. So we think that ultimately, this devalues that college degree and forces students to have to go through another 4 years of schooling after that. And if they try to fix that, the problem just expands onto later things. So we think that that's not how to do this. But it also devalues our college degree in another way. It devalues our college degree by making it not as good as it could be. Currently, we have college degrees that are really valuable and have a lot of research and a lot of individual attention from teachers and a lot of growth and development. But what happens when you try to stretch already thin funding too thin? We don't have these programs. We don't have quality education. And a college degree which is now unvaluable because everyone has one, and is even less valuable because it's worse than the high school education system, doesn't do anything for anyone. So we think that ultimately trying to provide this devalues the college degree completely and makes graduate school the new college, and individuals will just be forced into paying for that. So even for those facilitative rights that they try to solve for, they can't do because they don't provide individuals this additional step which will now become necessary. But the next thing I want to talk to you about is there actually a group of individuals that can't get access to college? Because they talk a lot about individuals that can't afford it and minority groups and loans being bad. But we tell you that with how much you'd have to raise taxes, You're essentially having them pay for loans on their own. Imagine how much a college degree costs. It's roughly $40,000 to $50,000 a year per student. Now you're trying to pay for every single student in the United States to have that out of the pocket of the taxpayers. That is going to make the cost be deflected onto everyone, which means that ultimately everyone is paying the college loans anyway. Instead, we have systems in the status quo to help. If you work hard, you can get a scholarship. If you are from an abused group, you can get an affirmative action financial aid. If you are from a poorer family, they do offer means-tested financial aid. So individuals that are disadvantaged in the status quo have help, but let those that can pay for it, and lighten the burden on the rest of society. The final question is, what happens to our degrees? Because we think that one of the best things about going to college is that there are literally hundreds of degrees that you can choose from. That if I want to go and learn how to play flute at college, I can do that. That if I want to go and do art, I can do that. But when you put the funding in the hands of the government and they have very little funding to work with, they have to decide things to cut. And the first things that are going are our liberal arts programs. The first things that are going are the things that diversify our opinions and diversify our education. If you're afraid of a world of engineers and lawyers and doctors, then maybe you shouldn't pass this resolution, because that's what the government is going to end up bundling out. Because it doesn't want those things that make us diverse and make us unique. It wants the things that make it money. So ultimately, we think that you should oppose this resolution in order to preserve the value of our education and the diversity of it.
The Speaker for her summation, and finally recall the Prime Minister to close the round with a rebuttal speech summing up the case for the resolution without new arguments.
Here, here.
So in 12 minutes of speeches, I was waiting for some argument, any argument from side opposition, about why this should not be a constitutional right. They gave us various random arguments, apparently taken from the Tea Party line, about how this will raise taxes, and about how this is somehow going to lower the value of a college degree. I'll get to those arguments later, because they're really, really silly. But nowhere did they deal with our fundamental claim here, which is that there is some right to a government and a government-funded education, right? We tell you that even if you buy their arguments, this isn't how we assess rights claims. We're not like, oh man, if we give people the right to property, it's gonna impede the economy because we'll have to make it harder to build roads, right? No, we say you have a fundamental right. That's why it's a right. Even if we think it's good for the economy, we don't take it away from you. This is a terrible argument. Did they ever deal with our rights claim? What was it? First, that you have a fundamental right here because you are in a minority. They said, we have affirmative action. Great, irrelevant to this argument. A, affirmative action hasn't worked. See that whites still attend college in much higher numbers, proportionally speaking. Secondly, this isn't the argument we were making. We were saying the young are disadvantaged in society because they're incapable of actually forcing elderly people to actually pay taxes to fund their education. And Stephen said something fascinating in MO, which is rights are based on responsibilities. Exactly. And we think if you went to college, you have the responsibility to help pay for other people, instead of free riding on the system, graduating, and then never paying your taxes and voting against the young. We think the young deserve this right. We think they do not have it now. Stephen says you can vote, yeah, after you're 21 and you're 3 years in debt. No, they don't have the ability to vote. They don't have power. They don't have the ability to influence society. We think we should give it to them. Additionally, though, we told you this was a facilitative right. Again, no actual rights-based response from them. They just say, nah, facilitative right. College degrees will be worth less. That's not the argument here. The argument here is that in order to achieve your full potential, you need to actually keep being able to educate yourself further if you have that potential. They never respond to this. So ultimately, if you believe there is a right to reach your full potential, if you believe that in a society you shouldn't be cut off from opportunity simply because you were born into the wrong family, you're voting for us. Second issue in this round, does it actually make society better? Here's where their really silly arguments come in. They say college degrees become worthless. But this is a self-defeating argument. If we admit more people to college and colleges have to pay them, nowhere in our case did we say we're admitting more people. We're saying people now who would be admitted and couldn't pay for it should get a free ride from the government. Nowhere are more people going to college on our side. So all this argument is also self-defeating, because unless colleges are admitting significantly more people, there's not going to be more college degrees. What is the difference on our side is who gets those college degrees. Are they people who happen to come from middle-class backgrounds and can afford them, or are they the poor? This is a silly argument. Second, they say quality will go down. I wanted to stand, and Stephen wouldn't take me, and ask one word: why? He gave no justification behind this argument. He just said they'll go down. But we're not admitting more people. In fact, we're admitting better people, because they're people who probably really, really deserve to be in college if they manage to work their way in from a terrible environment. I think we get better quality on our side. But what we do on our side is help the poor. We told you that right now, the poor don't think they can go to college. Ashley just says, no, the poor can totally go to college, guys. It's fine. But what we told you is that, first of all, the poor don't even have that expectation. If you grow up in a horrifying neighborhood in like parts of Camden, you don't think you're going to go to college at all. So you don't even try. And even if you get in, you think you won't be able to pay. So you don't even try. So by a mere accident of birth, future possibilities are foreclosed from you. We think that any ethical democracy has to protect the rights of those people, has to stand up and say, we will pay for your college. Then people know that they have that opportunity, and they try to give themselves every opportunity they can. We're proud of
All right, we hope you enjoyed the debate. The faculty will be next after a very, very brief scene change here.
Always willing to risk my ignorance about what's the proper procedures are in a debate, but I was very much struck by the absence on either side of much concern with anything factual. It seems to me that there's a whole world of nations, to the best of my knowledge, the more civilized ones have higher education which is free. This may be a good thing, it may not be a good thing, but that would be where I might look first. I also might look as a historian to Thomas Jefferson's vision, which is that there should have been a national university, and when he became president, he indeed instituted a university for military persons, and it still exists today, the West Point, and then joined later by Naval and Air Force Academies. You do pay a price in terms of serving the nation, but the education is free. And so the fascinating questions raised on both sides, to me, had an abstractness about them, which might have looked different if we asked, so does Japan's educational system not produce very good people, or France's, or Italy's, United Kingdom? So that was just occurring to me, and it didn't go away as a doubt about things, but I still enjoyed the debate enormously.
One of the questions I had that I think wasn't really addressed until very much towards the end is what is it that we think a college education is for, such that it ought to be enshrined as a constitutional right, or that ought to be opposed? It seemed like towards the end we're talking about reaching potential. How exactly college does that? I mean, ideally it does, but sometimes it doesn't, I suppose. There was some mention of earning potential, that a college education would increase your earning potential. So should a college education be enshrined in the Constitution because it's going to lead to higher earning? Is it going to broaden your horizons in some way? If that's the case, you probably want to deal with curricular questions of what kinds of courses are you going to take. I guess something that I think would be worth talking about further, maybe in the room, is why is college so important? Period. But certainly, why is college so important? What do we think is so important about a college education, such that we would take this step of enshrining it in our Constitution? Let me just say one sort of other point. It strikes me that our Constitution does certain things well. It focuses its attention on certain issues fairly clearly. And when you think about the amendments that have been passed, Bill of Rights, Civil War amendments, women's suffrage. You have a group of people who are clearly identifiable in the civil rights, in the Civil War amendments ending slavery and women's suffrage certainly, and say in the 18-year-old voting, is that a constitutional amendment?
Yes.
Okay. There's a group of people who you can fairly clearly identify who are being excluded from some fundamental, basic participation, inclusion in the system. And the amendment process removes that exclusion. Think about the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights, placing limits on the power of the federal government, a litany really of things the government should not do. I think that for these kinds of issues, the constitutional route makes a lot of sense. Of course, we had the civil rights, Civil War amendments in the 1860s. We still had to have a Civil Rights Act, which was not a constitutional amendment, but a piece of legislation 100 years later, because even though the legal status of slavery was removed, there were still all sorts of social and economic inequalities that persisted. So perhaps another way to look at this question is, to tie in the thing I said before, is what is it about college that we think we ought to amend the Constitution for? It seems like those kinds of issues are ones that we tend to think of as rising to some kind of very high level of injustice than prohibition. I won't, especially in the college crowd. But I enjoyed myself greatly, and look forward to hearing what other people have to say.
Well, thank you for inviting me this evening. One of the things that wasn't mentioned, and in all candor I should reveal to you, is not only do I have this deanly role where higher education is the focus of my daily concern, I've been in the political science department here teaching constitutional law and Supreme Court and jurisprudence and whatnot for a number of years. So I was interested to hear that the format tonight was modeled on the British parliamentary system, because indeed you stayed very true to that, in the sense that, as you may know, Britain doesn't have a constitution, and very little about the argument tonight really dealt with constitutionalism. And to echo some of what Professor Murphy just said, the questions of what belongs in a constitution and what doesn't. Now, to build on Professor Bell, what a constitution is has evolved greatly over the 200+ years since the United States pioneered the first written constitution. Britain still muddles along without a written constitution. The Soviet Union had a long written constitution. It guarantees a right to an higher education. Apparently Tanzania also has a written constitution that guarantees a right to an education, as do a number of other countries mentioned, and the International Convention on Human Rights, the United Nations Convention on Human Rights, calls for a right to education. 49 of the 50 states in their constitutions include a right to education. New Jersey is one that includes a right to a thorough and efficient education. That's always been interpreted to mean just up through high school. And we can see the enormous problems that have been reaped as we tried to sue to enforce that right to some sort of equal, thorough, and efficient education in New Jersey. The United States Constitution, as written, does not guarantee a right to education at any level, in any form. Now, exactly how, in the modern day, we would expect a democracy to work with an uneducated citizenry, but the framers were a group of largely self-educated men. Remember, at the founding of the country, there were only 7 colleges. Rutgers was one of them. In 1766. And I
always get confused now as to which year's the Constitution, which year's the, because I've got 1766 in my head from seeing it around here so much. But at any rate, if you look at the Constitution, it's actually an incredibly boring document. And if you don't believe me, I'll read a few passages. I assume you all have. But it's mostly about procedures and protocols. It's like reading the rules of baseball instead of actually watching a game. The Bill of Rights does protect rights, but it does so by limiting government power. And so a right to something is a fundamentally different move than we have anywhere else in the Constitution. And so that's something I'd want to think about as I explored this. The traditions of constitutional interpretation are such that if you guarantee a right to a free college education, that will end up meaning that you have guaranteed a right to a college education, and people will not be able to be excluded. And so your underlying premise of, I think, both sides, that colleges would still be able to be selective would be somewhat undermined. There's a large debate out there that I would let my more learned colleagues in political theory explore with you in another venue about whether the distinction between positive and negative rights. But the United States Constitution is largely dealt with negative rights in the sense that it lists things that government cannot do to you. This would be framed as something that government's required to do for you. I feel like somewhat of a traitor making these observations, because in my utopian world, everyone would have the opportunity to pursue the advanced study of the liberal arts and sciences, unfettered by cost or concerns about marketability of the degree later on, or credits, or any grades, or any of that stuff. But it was really fascinating to listen to you guys approach this, and I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the other views in the room as we get to question and answer.
So at this point, we'd like to invite people to form a well-ordered, well-educated line here, single file, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them, and you may address them to any given individual panelist or debater, to the crowd as a whole, and we'll sort of sort out how to field them at that level. So please don't be shy, step right up.
Professor,
People from the audience.
I just wanted to address Dr. Bell's point before questions came underway.
If you like.
Dr. Bell, you mentioned
Don't be shy.
Yes, please. You mentioned that you were concerned about the lack of factual data, for example, you brought into it. Under the parliamentary form of debate that we have, we're actually it actually works against us to be able to bring in that, because while government is able to introduce a case of their choosing, it's not fair to the opposition to bring in a case that, say, has a lot of facts or data to it that the opposition might not be able to prepare for in advance.
That's my remarks by saying my ignorance of the regulations of debate. Nonetheless, if I continue just a second while people are getting up to the microphone, I don't agree with Professor Lawrence that countries that have the right to higher education have suddenly had all the doors knocked. That's just not true. It's not true in Italy, it's not true in France. They have very high standards. It's not true in England, it's not true in Japan. I don't know anywhere where it is true. Maybe Tanzania, I don't know.
I just have one comment before the question. I had a similar debate in the college I came from, and one of the very important statistics that came up, two very important statistics, is one, of the amount of people that dropped out of college, 37% of them dropped out in good academic standing. And the reason was finances. And also another second statistic that was very important, that to me was one of the most heartfelt statistics was that we are investing more money in our prison systems than we are in our education. Now, that means that we're paying more for our criminals than we are for our educators. I just wanted to throw that and see what was the response to that statistic and how you feel about what the government was defending. Sorry to make you nervous.
No.
You know, if we could get that constitutional funding, we could afford.
That's right. I think one of the things that goes on in a debate that keys itself to a constitutional question is that there's no reason politically, I mean, every reason politically, but there's no, I think, and one of the, I believe you all may have made this point. There's nothing in the way of increasing or decreasing funding for any sets of issues, whether it be prisons, education, whatever. When you're talking about a constitutional right, I think this was sort of your stirring closing was, it's more than just saying we think this is something that's a good idea if it's affordable. You're making a more fundamental claim that something that's guaranteed constitutionally is something that's beyond the cost-benefit analysis. We don't say, well, it's kind of expensive to have freedom of the press. All these lawsuits pop up, and so we really want to find a better way to make this more affordable. No, that's the theory of rights is that, and constitutional rights especially, I think, is that we don't subject these to this kind of cost benefit, that the same way we do when we have policy debates about should we spend more or less on prisons, education, food inspection, or whatever. So I think one of the things that the constitutional language that's in the room really does is raise the thing to a level of significance, at least in the American case where the Constitution really is kind of the core, it's boring, certainly, but it has this kind of mythic status for Americans that it puts things beyond the pale. You simply, you can make all kinds of arguments for and against them, but if something is outlawed in the text of the Constitution, you have a much harder argument to make. So I think that all the things that you point out are entirely valid, and they're actually quite compelling to me in terms of my own political views as to where we're going to put our resources. Whether or not the question of college education rises to the constitutional level, I think is where the next kind of set of questions and debates would have to be.
May I? Oh, sorry. I have to agree with what you said, Dr. Murphy. I think that the Constitution, maybe just because of my own personal opinions, but I think the constitutional prerogative for educational rights, I'm a bit of a devil's advocate for myself in this debate, but in terms of the actual Constitution, I think it's right there in the preamble to promote the general welfare. I think that when you look at education today, it's absolutely imperative that in order to improve general welfare, that people have a right to receive the best of their potential in our society. And I think whatever the cost may be to society, everything is a cost. The fact that we're able to have microphones for this debate that may or may not work, are a trade-off. In fact, we might be able to say have another cop somewhere, or say have another teacher in another program, or have one more student that can go into the school. We make these trade-offs in society all the time. And so, the argument I make about taxes is a little facetious because, look, at the end of the day, we all pay something to get something. Rights that we are given also involve someone else's rights being taken away. I think when we as a society weigh what the responsibilities we have as a liberal democracy, which is what we are, I think a right to an education is extremely vital to having any kind of citizenry that can reflect the values that our Constitution inscribes to us. Dave?
I was just going to say that seems far more of a commentary on how ridiculously broken our prison system is on anything else.
This is also valid.
So this is a question for Syed Bob. So you addressed the issue about how there are already programs implemented to help minorities and impoverished people to go to college. Now, how does going with do you as a side of opposition believe that the status quo is more beneficial for those minority groups than going with the government?
Ladies first?
So what I actually believe, or what I should say for the debate?
Speak as set up.
Okay, so if I'm speaking from the position that I'm taking in the debate, I would say status quo is probably better because we would be like deflecting those prices back onto individuals through taxation, as well as drastically decreasing the value of a college education, which I do think is actually true because what one of the professors said was that like the right to a free education would be interpreted as a right to an education for everyone. And I think that like Dave's caveat there wouldn't actually hold, that we would end up interpreting that as anyone who wanted to go could go.
Who told you that going to grad school would make you more money? They were lying.
Well, it depends on what kind of graduate
It
school.
very much depends.
If it's law school, if it's medical school.
No, not law school anymore.
They are in trouble. Law school graduates have high unemployment rates right now.
Please stop scaring me.
However, if you had a constitutional right to a free education and everybody's suing,
Did you also want me to respond to that question, or?
If you want, go ahead.
Henry, you know me, I love to talk. Anyway, actually, I will keep it short though, which is very unusual for me, I know. So basically, if I were to be on the side of opposition, I would argue that there are better ways to treat the core issues of our problems with low-income Americans, poverty, the cycle of one-parent households, the difficulties with crime and illiteracy in our public school systems that already exist at the local level. And I think that should be the chief target, because without a strong high school, middle school education, you're not going to be able to compete in college at the same level as people who say came from the suburbs. Someone, I guess I was fortunate enough under the veil of ignorance to be born in the suburbs. So I start off with that kind of high school education that puts me ahead of someone who, even with affirmative action to be able to get into college, still starts at somewhat of a disadvantage. So I think if we're going to treat the issue of inequality amongst the poor in our society, we need to start at that, before they even get to college. It would be my argument on that.
do you guys know this reference to the veil of ignorance? Besides, it makes a great Halloween costume. Andrew Murphy could give it better, but it's basically a dressed up version of, remember when you and your sibling were fighting over who got the last piece of cake? And mom said, you cut, you choose? Okay. Behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know whether you're going to be born male, female, white, black, purple, handicapped, whatever. Rich, poor parents, whatever. And so what kind of world would you want to be born into when you don't know what advantages you're going to have?
This is for anyone, really. Do you think that basically anyone who gets into college, automatically it's free? Or should there be some kind of process to see like how much aid they need?
I mean, your parents make $500,000 a year. I don't know, I'm just not that sympathetic. I mean, I would say it should be a pretty high threshold. I would say if there's any reason to believe that you're going to be financially pressured, then yeah, you should pay for it. I mean, that's what I would say, both for the case and for reality.
I mean, I think it's unfair to paint everything with a broad brush and say 500,000 is too much. I mean, someone making $500,000 in New Jersey would be different from, say, someone earning $500,000 in Oklahoma or Nebraska, a state with a lower average income. So I think that when you compare, say, a family that is paying for multiple kids to go to college, to say just because you earn $500,000 a year doesn't mean you get bupkis for helping your kids get to college. I think that's I do think that's a little unfair. I think it has to be based on what kind. It can't be like a flat test. It has to be based on the different weighing requirements we do in status quo.
Again, distressed by the lack of looking at actual experience. So the City University of New York system from 1837 until the 1970s had free education for anyone who lived in the city of New York and achieved a high average. It didn't cause everyone to go to college or feel they had a right to do anything. If you didn't have a very high average in high school, you didn't go. But if you did, you went. It didn't matter if your parents were multimillionaires. You still didn't pay anything because there was nothing to pay. But most multimillionaires didn't choose, who could get into the city university system, didn't choose to go there. They went to Columbia instead, so not a problem.
Yeah, my only point, Elizabeth, is that when you establish a constitutional right under the way the court interprets rights, they're probably going to strike down, or at least it'll
So
trigger
you think they
heightened
would strike
scrutiny.
down,
At
they
least
had to have an
trigger-
88 average and had
Well, that,
taken all the right
actually,
academic
you know what,
subjects.
that brings up the other question that this.
I don't know how you'd fix this.
Yeah, I don't know either,
I know
because
it
it
worked for
brings
over
up the
hundreds of
other,
years.
well, no. What
Nobody
worked
sued
there
anybody.
was that nobody paid. That's
Nobody
the
paid,
difference.
but nobody sued anybody because they didn't get in. It was too damn bad. You weren't, you stupid,
Yeah.
you didn't work hard, you don't go, that's all. Everybody understood the system. That was
I
the
think-
immigrants in school.
One of the questions, the question here raised for me was, what do we mean by college?
Mhm.
What counts as a college? City University most certainly does, and Rutgers certainly does. But what about that stuff that they sing about on the commercials about pajamas?
So recently I went on MIT's website and I can have a whole math major, a whole economics major, a whole physics major. They have like 15 classes that would comprise for me the core classes and electives, probably like every subject that interests me for the most part. I mean, I didn't look at the arts and stuff, and it's MIT, so I don't know if they have that, but you know, in light of that, in light of like free information, I think that kind of changes the debate, because we talk about upward mobility, and that's like an important thing for having a degree, right? It's like that's signaling, but just in terms of achieving your potential, if you really wanted to, like in education, like that has the lectures, the notes, the homework, the tests, and a recommended textbook, which is often free.
Yeah, but then the idea that college is necessary or sufficient for any of us to reach our potential, I think, is an empirical question. I'm not sure if any of us have evidence that this is the case. I mean, we want to think it is the case. For some of us, it might be the case. For some of us, it might not be. So I think that's sort of what I was getting at. I was saying, well, why is it that, other than the fact that we're on a college campus, it makes sense to talk about college. But what is it about college, let alone what do we think a college is and what isn't a college, what is it about a college education that we would consider raising it to the status of this kind of sacrosanct? Is it just to increase your earning potential? That could be achieved other ways. Right? Is it to deal with the problems of poverty? That could be dealt with by amending the Constitution to provide a living wage, or a negative income tax done through policy, or through various other options. So I think that one of the things that this has really got me thinking about is why do so many people want to go to college? Why do we, or who are up here, think it's an important thing? I mean, if no one went, then we would be out of work. The empty lecture hall is not really appealing to the professor, at least. To the students, it might be. But really, so two things that we all, I think are important: college education and the Constitution, and what they have to do with each other. I think I'm still trying to figure out. But these are the kinds of questions that are kind of puzzling.
I'd actually like to follow up on what you just said. I think that, at least from my perspective, I didn't go to Rutgers for undergrad. I apologize. I went to Rutgers University, also in New Jersey, and basically the perspective I've developed, because I was a part of the ambassador program there, so what I did was I would have students who were in high school who were trying to figure out which college was the right one for them. And the advice I gave them basically is that college is what you make of it. It's not about necessarily the value of said degree, but the amount of energy and the amount of effort you put into it and what you use after. I would definitely state with absolute conviction that a bright student from Rutgers will do much better in life than a lazy student from Yale. I really think that is the case. I think that when you look at a life, it's not a matter of just, here's a diploma, here's a few more contacts you might have found here along the way, now good luck. No, it's about 50, 60 more years after that, in which your energy, your intelligence, your desire add up over time.
All three of us, we weren't laughing at you, all three of us over here were talking about a president we had.
And it shows you are better off than the lady
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I mean, I think what college gives a lot of people in terms of
sort of achieving their potential is the tools to do that, because even if you're not, like, you're still learning after college, I would hope, but even if you're not going on to, like, get your PhD, I feel like college is supposed to at least give you sort of the tools you need, right? I know how to read text now in a way that I probably didn't before college, and even if I never end up, God help me, going to, like, grad school or something, you know, even if I'm just learning as an autodidactic person, I still know how to actually take in information and process it in a more sophisticated way than I would have otherwise. So I think, I don't know, in terms, if college is sort of reaching your maximum intellectual potential, I mean, maybe that's impossible, but it is giving you the tools to do so, I think, in a way that lesser education doesn't. Like, I feel like high school is sort of, maybe it should be more, but ultimately, for most people it is, it's sort of teaching them the very basic tools, like reading, writing, and, you know, arithmetic, hopefully more than that.
I also think college, you need a college education to gain some sort of credibility as to what you've learned, obviously, and I think that's very convenient to society. Because if you know you have a BS in like engineering or something, it can gauge to a certain extent what you actually know. And obviously you can determine what a college is by having like some basic set of what like accurate is, right? And I think that really makes it convenient to society to like gauge what level of learning a person comes to that society has. I think that makes it very easy to learn.
Any other questions?
Okay. No, go on. We were just scared that somebody in the room might think that you could only learn in college. And we want you to keep being autodidactic everywhere.
So one thing which was on my mind during the debate was that obviously a lot of people in America might disagree with certain educations or courses of study for political or religious reasons. And we make people fund a lot of things they don't necessarily support all the time, but we do it through passing laws democratically, where at least there's some idea that you're consenting to it or could vote that it not happen. Is there something different about causing people to support these things they oppose, not through laws that are being passed by democratic bodies, but through a non-democratic constitution which exists and supersedes the democratic role?
Thank you, Reed, for giving me op philosophy.
Well, actually, isn't the Constitution amended by the legislature, so therefore it does have to be by a democratic vote?
To amend the U.S. Constitution, I looked this back up to make sure I had it right here. The constitutional amendment has to be approved by a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress or called for by a convention, but that's never happened, so let's just stay in reality. Semi-reality. Although people like the Tea Party still want to bring the idea of calling the constitutional conventions into it. It has to be passed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress and ratified by 3/4 of the states, either in state legislatures, which has happened every time except once, or by state ratifying conventions. And in the early days, they ratified one by state ratifying conventions instead of legislatures. So it goes through a democratic process. The difference is, as did the Constitution, the difference is that in order to repeal it, you have to go through that extraordinary supermajority process again.
Which is why.
Or get the right justices on the Supreme Court.
It just shows how much you really, really hated prohibition.
Yeah. It was costing a lot of businessmen a lot of money.
And making out the fun a lot.
Oh yeah. Another thing is that if you let policy influence education, the role it plays in our society, like as governments come and go, the first thing they tackle is education budget. They have to make like room in the budget or something like that. And at the point where we let a change in government change education policy, it does not create the environment of assurance or stability that we are aiming for, encouraging minorities to pursue higher education, right? So if it's constitutional right, any government cannot just come and change it. It cannot just like make cuts in the budget like that. We think that that would be more, it will encourage people to like stick to school and go to college.
I was going to say, yeah, I mean, I feel like the difference between saying something's a good policy versus something should actually be constitutionally protected. I mean, I think we like the idea of like negative rights and government should like stay off my property and that's what rights are for. But I feel like that's a very American notion, and I feel like a lot of other constitutions don't treat rights that way. I think that's probably better. But I do feel like it's sort of when the democratic process doesn't solve for policy, that's maybe when we ought to have some sort of constitutional protection, like a sort of similar idea as a lot of countries have like some sort of minimum standard of living enshrined in their constitution, right? Like the US has welfare programs. I'd argue they're really, really bad, partially because there's never enough political will behind them to actually support them very well. So, you know, that's sort of a distinction between something that's a policy versus an actual enshrined right in the Constitution.
Well, I think that will do it for our question and answer session. Thank everyone for coming out tonight. Thank our faculty panelists especially, and the debaters who participated.
Yeah, I just also wanted to wish the debate team well and your continued climb through the rankings. Look forward to hearing your success. Continue to keep trouncing the Ivy League. This gives us a lot of pleasure, of course. I did want to ask just all of you, you're here, so you must care about all things governmental. You must be committed to understanding how our government works and the role we can play in it. So I would ask you to please be involved, stay involved. There are some tables outside about how you could contribute to the Are You Voting? Continue to look at Targum. You will see other ads for other Darien Fund events for civic engagement. I want to thank Harini Kadambi. She's probably outside. She helped organize tonight, and she's the head of the Are You Voting Coalition. She and a number of other students, a lot of them are involved in Eagleton, they're political science or history majors, but that's not required. But they are students who are active and engaged in our community on these topics. And I would encourage you to please stay involved, and please continue to be involved in Darien Fund events. We now have a blog. It's brand new, and it's not up. We'll send an announcement around about it, but it's now called RutgersDarienFund.wordpress.com, and we'll add it to the Rutgers website shortly. And this will be a place where students can engage in these debates, and faculty will be responding. It'll be moderated by someone in some students in political science. And we'd like to keep these conversations alive and keep you all engaged. Every year, around the anniversary of the signing of the ratification of our Constitution, September 17, I think 1789, we have Constitution Day events, but we will have them throughout the year. So once again, I thank you for coming and would invite you to come to more of these kind of programs. And I really can't say enough about our faculty members who on pretty short notice said, yeah, they'd come out and help discuss these topics with us. So I do thank them again for that.
And we promised before we let you go that we would have the results of the vote as you decided, and by almost a 2-to-1 margin, this House has affirmed the resolution that there ought be a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to a free college education. So please stay for the and please join us just outside for the involvement fair, civic engagement fair. If you're interested in debate, come talk to us. If you're interested in other civic participation, please talk to the people at the tables, and have a great night.